Welcome everybody to episode 3 of The View From Here. You can see I'm quite rugged up at the moment. It's quite a bit cooler today than it was when I first recorded this episode. And I want to introduce it a little bit before I go on. Now I'm rugged up because in the present circumstances and being unemployed, I really don't wish to have to pay any extra for electricity. I actually rent this house off my friend, and she very generously includes electricity in the rent, so I don't want to burden her with any extra costs. Episode 3 of The View From Here represents a turning point. I don't know how many of you have seen Hannah Gadsby's Nanette, and this piece of work is certainly not of the quality of that, nor my experiencing anything like hers. But I want to say that this represents a turning point for me. I've paid 3 times in my life now a very, very high cost, lost almost everything I owned, lost my personal wealth, lost my jobs, my business, through self-advocacy. If you want to know what's wrong with the present way that people do diversity and inclusion, which asks those of us who are marginalised to make the biggest contributions and then punishes us when we step outside the boundaries of what they deem to be reasonable from their perspective rather than ours, then this video will tell you about that experience. Another word, I guess, of somewhat of warning: if you are a recruiter, a hiring manager, a senior professional, visiting my profile or that of Dr. Mel's. Now I don't even know if she has one on LinkedIn anymore. But if you're here to review our profiles, or mine in particular, to see if I'm a good fit to your organization, a good cultural fit to your organization, I want you to know this. Cultural fit is the absolute antithesis of diversity and inclusion. Cultural fit has no place in any organization's recruiting strategy, particularly has no place in the recruiting strategies of any organization that claims to be supportive of diversity and inclusion. So if you're here to look at my profile to see if I'm the kind of person that fits your culture, then frankly, I don't want to work for you. If you are a recruiting professional, hiring manager, or senior leader in an organization visiting my profile, and your purpose is to learn what's wrong with the present approach that almost all organizations, including the big winners of diversity and inclusion prizes, who I've dealt with throughout this process, if you're here to find out what's wrong and you're here to learn from people who suffered at the hands of those who run your diversity and inclusion strategies, who suffered at the hands of your HR departments, who are not our friends, who suffered at the hands of your recruitment policies that are in no way inclusive, refuse to take steps to identify those of us who are marginalised, and refuse to adapt any of the processes to allow us to have equal access to jobs and career advancement. If you're here to learn about that, welcome. Welcome. This will be my final video about diversity and inclusion ever. Just as Hannah Gadsby said she was retiring from comedy, but didn't actually retire, what she did was she said that she refuses now to do self-deprecating humour. I'm now refusing to do self-advocacy. Will I come and talk to your organisation about diversity and inclusion if you want me to? Sure, but I won't do it on your terms. I'll do it on mine. And I'll make those terms very clear to you before I ever agree to turn up and speak. I won't engage in self-advocacy. I won't engage in advocacy for the trans and gender diverse community any longer. I will do work on diversity and inclusion for the trans and gender diverse community. I will assist people who want assistance. I won't advocate for the community. I've paid too high a price too many times. So, on to episode 3 of The View from Here. Hello, Mel.
Hello, everybody.
And I think we should start because, some people might know me from previous episodes, but a lot of people who've watched this maybe don't know you. So let's start with an introduction to who is Dr. Melanie Thompson.
Oh, well, who am I? It's been a question I've asked myself a lot in the last couple of years. But I am a fully trained microbiologist that specialises in emerging infections. So you'd think I'd be in demand right now, but I'm also a person who's active in the disability leadership space, and I'm a member of the Disability Leadership Institute, and I'm also active in the D&I networks in Melbourne. So I'm part of the EON network, and so I do a lot of disability advocacy as the pro bono stuff. And I know that's how we met, is that we were on an intersectionality panel and I was the token disabled person and you were the token trans person.
Yes.
And I was sitting next to the token Aboriginal person at the SAGE, first inaugural SAGE, which is science and gender equality movement for the academic sector, back when I used to work in the academic sector before I was bullied out and discriminated out. And those were the days where I was allowed to say things on stage and not get into trouble from,
Actually,
people I worked with.
It's really good that you bring up that particular SAGE event, because I probably ruffled a few feathers at that event as well, I would say.
I think I did. Oh, hang on, sorry. I've been joined by my dog.
Joined by the colleague.
This is my lab assistant, Napoleon.
Assistant.
He's my lab assistant. He's really, I think I'm going to have to go to HR about him, though. He tends to bark at things when I'm trying to do Zooming. But
don't go to
hopefully
HR.
He'll be quiet. Don't go to HR. Yeah. I'm the CEO of this company, so I am HR.
Yeah. All right. So thanks for that intro, and also the covering off on how we met, because I think that was that's important. We both have been quite passionate advocates for diversity and inclusion, and in particular passionate about an intersectionality approach. And I know someone else that we both know, Zalika Zavello, has also been quite adamant about an intersectionality approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But before,
and I mean, that's why when I saw your first episode of Soaring Sisters and saw that you were talking about the D&I staff, and then you were saying in later episodes you were going to be talking about intersectionality, I was just like, pick me, Kimberly, please.
wrong YouTube channel, but
sorry, what is it?
This one's called The View from Here. So just for those who don't know, I also am a glider pilot, and I have a channel about gliding.
Sorry.
Mel was referring
I follow both of them. I follow both of them.
All right. Anyway, we've both been quite passionate advocates of D&I. We've both been active in the D&I space, and we both, had this intersectionality view. But we've both kind of seen the bad side, shall we say. I'm trying to be very charitable here. We've both seen the less than perfect side of the diversity and inclusion space. And I know...
Yeah, well, I mean, it's bad. And I've suffered some pretty bad lateral violence from people I've met in the D&I space. I mean, I literally almost got taken away and sectioned when I was at a Women in Science conference in America, because the Kiwi lawyer that I was billeted with in a room tried to wake me up in my deep sleep cycle, and because I was burbling, she thought I had concussion from falling over earlier, and she called the ambulance and the police, and they literally were going to take me away and bankrupt my life to take me away to hospital. And I said, no, I'm not going. This is America. I know my rights. So, I said, whatever indemnity forms you want me to sign, just let me sign it. And she was some kind of, I don't know, malignant narcissist type person. And there's quite a lot of malignant narcissists in this space. And it's been quite bad. And I've been thrown under the bus by a lot of malignant narcissists in this space. I've lost work. I've lost, opportunities. And, I pretty much, and this is in more than one country. This has happened to me in Australia. This has happened to me in the US. And so I've sort of got to learn the hard way who it is that I can trust. But it's been a hard journey. And people that I thought I could trust, when they were stress tested, particularly on things like sexual harassment, basically sided with the man. Yes. And went, nothing to see here. I'm like, but you run Women in STEM Australia. What do you mean there's nothing to see here? And so they didn't stand true to their values. And I was really, really disappointed when I find out that basically they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk when they're stress tested. But I would say a person in this space who I do respect and who I stress tested and absolutely passed the stress test is Brian Schmidt from ANU, who was one of the co-founders of Sage. He really believes this. And I went to him, I said, one of your friends, one of your network contacts, Lawrence Krauss, grabbed my friend on the tit. I saw it, and he said, well, you know what you need to do, Mel. You know what's right.
Yes, and we paid a price there, don't we? You paid a price for taking that action.
I've paid a lot of a price, but I do still have a few high-profile supporters who, like me, will stand by their values and act within accordance of their professed values. But unfortunately, there's a lot of grifters, particularly in the Improve Women, Fix the Women space, that basically sell, memberships to women's networking and this, that, and the other. There's some nice ones, but there's some that are just grifters, and they're out there to get you. And then when you basically challenge them on their values, they turn out not to have the values that they profess to have.
Absolutely.
And that they make money out of. And so it's really, really disappointing when you basically, and I've been asked by several employers now to really compromise my values, directly asked to compromise my values. And I'm just not prepared to do that. I would rather be unemployed than compromise my values. That is just literally, it's a hard line.
Yeah.
I will die on the hill of my values every time.
You and I both. And I'm going to mention, I'm being a little careful now. I've actually been, I'm going to use the word forced. Rather, what I implied at the time was that this was a matter of essentially structural dismissal or constructed dismissal, which is where somebody gives you no options but the options that you won't accept.
Yes.
And the
pretty much. I've been there.
That result in you having to give up your job, essentially. I've been in that situation, and, it said to the organisation involved that, this is in direct contravention of your very publicly espoused values. And, I'm living your values, essentially. But you and I know, I think, have had the same kind of experience. And I have to be careful here because I've had signed paper to say I can't talk about who this is and everything else about it.
Too. NDAs, we love them. They're supposed to be for IP.
Exactly, right? Supposed to be protecting intellectual property.
Yeah, not arseholes.
Anyway, the point of the whole thing, I guess, was that organisations talk about D&I, but what they're actually talking about is a little bit of what, in my diversity dimensions diagram, which I think you might have seen, is the intrinsic or inherent things. So, things like sexuality and gender and so on, things we can't change, essentially. And also some of the cultural elements of diversity, but they don't allow us to be the personality that we are, right? They don't allow us to...
exactly. And it's that, and you see a lot of the reports about minorities at work that have to cover and have to sort of assimilate to fit into cultures. And I found since coming back to Australia that Australia is a very monocultural corporate structure, both in academia, government, and corporate world, that there's certain people that are allowed to express themselves, and they tend to be the sort of younger, more when I was younger, I was allowed to do it. But then when I got older and I worked my way up the management chains, and I basically came into my sort of power, it became a problem for a lot of people that I was then either threatening their power or asking them to act, to walk the walk and not talk the talk.
To act according to the organisation's values mostly, right?
Correctly. And that self-advocacy was starting to be punished. And I think it's well documented that self-advocacy for underrepresented minorities in the workplace does tend to be punished.
Yes.
And it's interesting, some of the stuff you see where black women, particularly in America, and black men get punished for self-advocacy. They get called angry and troublemakers. And it's a real cultural thing. It's a real race-based thing. They're not allowed to be that angry black woman. And I'm not allowed to be the angry disabled woman, apparently. I'm not allowed to be the angry feminist. It's a real cultural problem in Australia. And it goes all the way, in my case, I've actually got the intersection of family violence in this case. I found out 2 months ago that it was my mother who complained to Deakin about my feminist ranting on Twitter. Okay, now she's a woman I have now taken out family violence intervention orders against, just to get her to stop sending sob stories about how I won't let her see her grandchildren to my employers. And she's done it twice now. And so thanks, Mum.
Oh.
Your grandchildren are going to starve because you keep complaining about me being a rabid feminist. Yeah? I know you want me to stay home and look after the kids, but geez, maybe someone should be out there trying to find cures for, I don't know, COVID-19 or something.
Something like that. Yeah, look,
that's what I used to do.
Yeah, and look, you of course know my story, and my story is a situation where, I've been the vocal person, supporting rights of not just myself, others as well.
Yeah.
And, I paid the price in the sense that I've had my door broken down by 8 police officers, and dragged away to the mental health ward, at which point the psych said, no idea why you're here, why don't you go home?
Yeah, what else? Yeah, go. There's the door.
Yes. Mind you, I had to walk home about 5 kilometres, but anyway.
But there is, that you do get this sort of people that decide that they know best for you. And this kind of sort of, it's either, I've had a lot of maternalistic and paternalistic people in my life that have tried to replace my, tried to mother me. And I'm like, don't try and mother me. My mother's someone I am estranged from. I don't like people trying to control me now that I'm an adult. Stop it. This gaslighting no, it's happened to me my whole life. I've had to do the work to get over it psychologically, and you will trigger my complex PTSD if you try and tell me to be a good girl.
Yeah,
it's not gonna happen.
Which brings me to another point. You mentioned complex PTSD, and I too am someone who lives with complex PTSD, and while it's often very difficult to diagnose that, we know what the symptoms are. So what I'm saying is, in my case, I'm living with the symptoms that align with PTSD and quite complex. So they range from, having worked in Central America during the
Nicaraguan war.
Contra stuff, right?
You were a photojournalist at that point, weren't I? Remember?
Yes, Honduras and that. Sexual assault, which I'm, sure lots of women can identify with. I was actually in a conversation, completely accidental, and I'll share this since I brought it up. When I first arrived in Sydney, I had some really good friends in the place that I live with, and we all used to go to a barbecue on a Friday night. So one Friday night we decided we'd all go to this friend's house and, drink too much wine.
Sounds fair. Sounds like what you should do.
While we were sitting in that lounge room having a chat, it was revealed that every single one of the 6 or 7 women in that room had been sexually assaulted.
Pretty much. We've all been there.
Incredible, right? Anyway, I won't go on to the other areas, but, obviously when you have a loving partner and, a good life and a business and 2 lovely houses, and you lose all of that and you end up homeless.
Well, that's it, yeah.
There's some trauma associated with that as well. So there's complex layers of trauma, right?
Absolutely.
And you've probably seen my writings, but organisations are not equipped to deal with that element of diversity, right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. This pandemic has really showed so-called normal people, because I don't really believe anyone's normal, who'd want to be, frankly. But, it's really showed people that have been living their lives in sort of, blinkered, ambivalent, ignorance, that actually shit happens, and it can happen to you and it can happen tomorrow. You can lose your job tomorrow and be down Centrelink, queuing around the block. Yeah. And, I've just applied for JobKeeper through my business as a sole trader today. But I've also got, DSP apps and Job Seeker in. But God, Centrelink's so much harder to deal with than the ATO. ATO is just press a button, pay you the money. But it really is. People are going to see this, and there's been lots of discussion in the disability space that I've seen around the disabled people going, see, now you know how we live all the time.
Yes, and I've had that conversation myself.
Yeah, and so we're hoping that it's actually going to improve sort of community connectedness. And hang on, has mine stopped working? That's better. Am I still on?
Yeah. So
okay,
you might have been picking up Bluetooth from somewhere else. There was a male voice.
Oh God, probably my husband's just rocked up to this. Well, my son. Oh, yeah.
All right. Sounded more like your husband than your son, but let's go back to where you started that.
Yeah. Okay, what was I crapping on about at the start of that conversation? I was talking about, that's right, the disability, the conversations happening in the disability space at the moment around the fact that now the wider population is really getting to experience what we experience all the time, which is fatigue and sort of anxiety and trauma from all of these sudden changes. And, I've spent the last 2 years basically learning to cope with this. So I'm prepared as a person and as a scientist to deal with this sort of situation, whereas most other people aren't prepared. And so you really start to see the resilience of people that have suffered trauma and dealt with trauma in their lives, to actually see this as, they're just going, this is not traumatic, just calm down, guys. But it will be traumatic for some people. And the fact that there is these different groups where you've got haves and have-nots, it's an issue. I'm lucky I can get my JobKeeper, but my husband, who's a long-term casual, so he's eligible for his company, they've told him they're not going to put it in for him, so he can't get it.
Yeah.
But he's been laid off. So, lucky I couldn't get it, because how else are we going to feed our kids?
I think I want to go back to what you talked about there, because I've raised this point as well about organisations are now going to have to learn how to deal with trauma, because they're going to have
trauma informed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've made that point, but one of the things that I think you were making in parallel to that just then that I want to raise is that part of what we get in trouble for is the process of dealing with that trauma, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And we're actually not allowed to run that process in our lives. That other people try to mother or, try to step in on that process and,
Yeah. We're adults, just leave us alone.
Totally.
We're not children. It's that infant, what was it, infant? I can't remember. I can't say the word. I'm having an MS, can't pronounce the word moment.
Yeah.
infantilization, something like
I think,
that.
yeah, is a
That
fair
one,
word.
did I get that right? But something like that. Don't ask me to spell it.
Treating us like
treating us like children or infants. And sorry, I've got holes in my brain, but like it's at the back in the lizard brain. My cognitive functions are still pretty A1. And so I don't need people thinking, you know, mummy or daddy knows best in my life, because my own parents basically traumatized me by that kind of trying to manipulate and gaslight me since I was about 4. And they tried to stop me from becoming a scientist. And, you know, when I became a scientist, then they tried to stop me being a scientist, and they succeeded. And so for me, having people try to manipulate me as an adult is really difficult. And I'm like, no, I just won't put up with your manipulation. I can see it coming and don't want it. I know your intentions are good. And this whole concept of intentions being good somehow absolves people that don't share our traumas from, you know, trying to help. I'm like, no, don't help. Just walk with me. Walk
exactly.
beside me. You know, I don't need you to do anything for me. I just need you to get where I am at the moment, and that I need space to deal with my trauma. And that I don't need you triggering it. And I mean, it's taken me years of therapy to work out what my triggers are. And I've worked out it is literally the old sort of cliched, you know, mummy and daddy issues. I mean, when you've been raised by malignant narcissists like I have, and there's 2 of them, it's both my parents, you know, it's really difficult to overthrow that. But because I've had that experience of family violence, and it's made me very self-reliant, but it's also made me very good at identifying true friends that I can trust. But I sometimes get it wrong, and the D&I space has been where I've got it the most wrong.
Yeah, okay. I'm starting to run out of light here, but that's all right. I want to move to something else, but before I go on to that other subject matter, I just want to point out to people that, you know, good leaders are actually really good at managing this. Now, I had a really good manager previously who, you know, we presented down in Melbourne, Women in Leadership, on something that we call Brave Conversations, which, you know, is about just what you talked about, knowing that we are resilient, well equipped to handle our own circumstance, that we just need somebody to come along with us and talk about it, you know, in a way that, you know, help me understand what I can do, if anything.
Yeah, well, that's it.
Yeah.
And but being punished for trying to advocate for self within sort of, you know, structural systems that are basically set up for male pale stales, which has been pretty much my life, has, you know, it really, it's difficult. It really is. And there's still, unfortunately, a lot of people in executive management roles that are from the old school, you know, neoliberal sort of, you know, the reputation is everything, you know, we'd rather give you an NDA to shut up than to listen to you. And I'm having that still from Deakin. I'm literally, you know, they won't let me talk to anybody at Deakin. I literally offered, I said, I want to come and help you to make sure and oversee your, you know, your sexual harassment plans, because I don't believe you're going to do it properly, because the perpetrator that sexually harassed me is still there. And I told you about it, and you knew about him years before I complained, and I had to leave, you know, and so that was that whole constructive dismissal thing. And, you know, they will the only person I'm allowed to talk to at Deakin is the lawyer. And they like, thanks for your offer of pro bono work as an expert D&I person, but no, we don't want you. Well, and it's just such a slap in the face, you know.
I suspect I've had the same thing. You know, someone who's really important in my life from a particular employment just doesn't even respond to me anymore. And I'm totally convinced that what's happened is the lawyers have stepped in and said there'll be no communication, which is really disappointing. But anyway.
It is.
When we first started having a little chat just before we started recording this, and also I'm noting your response to my previous video, which was about the barriers, which essentially is recruiting, right? we
Oh yeah.
see in my commentaries always has recently been around, you know, great that people are doing diversity and inclusion work, and from the trans perspective, you know, having transition policies for existing employees who, you know, come to you and say, hey, listen, I'm transitioning. But the real barriers for trans people and lots of other marginalised groups are actually around, we can't get access to jobs and we can't get access to career advancement.
Correct. I mean, I basically, when I declared my MS and then my mental health, comorbid mental health issues to Deakin, they basically began the process of trying to get rid of me because I became not the young, shiny, potentially fabulous thing. I became broken. And, you know, when you work for a medical school, broken is not allowed. They only want people they can fix. If you've got an incurable illness, then you need to move on. And so, you know, and particularly mental illness, because in medicine, doctors themselves are punished for reporting mental health issues. They're at risk of losing their entire license because they're not seen as having the inherent requirements of wellness, mental wellness for their jobs. And that's why you see so many doctor suicides. And we're going to see so many more after this COVID crisis. We've seen Dr. Breen, bless her, in New York already, take her own life because of the moral injury she suffered. And that's the problem when you're dealing with systems that put barriers in front of you so many times, you become morally injured. And I think a lot of people that try and make a real difference in the D&I space end up being morally injured by the people who put up barriers that are supposed to actually help. And that's what I talk about, lateral violence in the community quite a lot, because and as I say, I literally have nearly been dragged off to hospital and bankrupted to get a CT scan in an American hospital. Now, I don't have travel insurance. As a disabled woman, I can't get travel insurance for falling over and hitting my head. So I would have had to sell my house that my children live in because that rich lawyer from New Zealand had made a decision on my behalf, and she'd taken away my patient autonomy. And I was basically just ended up screaming at her like a harpy until she ran off in a flouncy huff, so that I could actually speak to the ambulance paramedics and the police and say, actually, she's just triggered my don't take away my autonomy PTSD. I'm sorry. But now I'm going to talk to you guys calmly because I'm married to an ex-policeman and I understand I need to talk to you politely, but I'm just, you know, let me sign whatever. I'm fine. I just want to go back to sleep. I'm knackered. I've got MS. It's been 4 days. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to go a little bit more into what we talked about before we started recording, which was that in my view, there's a total disconnect between the desire, or at least the public persona of a lot of organizations with respect to diversity and inclusion and the function that is recruiting.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can kind of elaborate on
it's interesting. I've got so many examples I could give you, but I'm going to give you the classic one related to my disease. So I have MS, multiple sclerosis, for those of you who need me to get that acronym. And I applied through Seek, one of these tick box algorithm type things, for a job working as an MS support disability worker to support my fellow MSs in Geelong. Okay, they were advertising a Geelong position in Geelong to help out other MS people. And I'm like, yeah, I could do that. I'm still fairly able-bodied as an MS person. I could help someone who isn't. And so I went through the process and I didn't even get an interview because I don't have some Cert 3 in disability studies or something. But I'm like, but I have the disease.
That's probably worth a Cert 3. I think they call that recognition of prior learning.
Well, I would have called it recognition of prior knowledge, but no, couldn't even get an interview. And I rang them and I went absolutely berserk. And then they offered to help me find a job because they're one of these disability employment service grifters. I'm like, you could have just given me that one.
Yeah, look, I've had similar. I've had a number of organisations with huge diversity and inclusion profiles, and a number of and applied for a number of jobs, including diversity inclusion, managers diversity inclusion, advisors, consultants, you name it. And you know my history in D&I.
Absolutely.
didn't even score an interview, not even an interview. And I've written back to some of them and said, I'm really curious about this because you said, there were other candidates with better alignment to what we were looking for, essentially. I forget the wording exactly. And, I've written back and said, yes, but, this is about diversity and inclusion. The role is actually a D&I role. And what you perhaps don't recognise is as a trans woman, I face a 40% chance of being fired from a role. In fact, it's happened several times. And when I lose that role, I'm fifth as likely to be employed in a role as, less qualified, less experienced cisgender peers. So, wouldn't it be a great example when hiring for a diversity and inclusion role if you recognised that and applied it to your recruitment functions?
Yeah, I know.
And I've had them come back and say, yeah, that's a great idea. Sorry about that.
I know, it's very bizarre. And, in the UK, they've got certain certifications now where they have to guarantee people interviews if they declare certain, listed things. Although the trans thing in the UK is weird. They're just nuts over there. And the stuff I've had to put, like they ask you 5 questions, like, well, were you different gender, sex at birth than your gender? And they they literally want to take photos of your genitals to apply for things in recruitment over there. It's just ridiculous. But as a disabled person, I've had it where the employer has had the disability scheme that says we will shortlist and interview any person that declares that they have a disability in recruitment. Okay, so I tested them out. University of Sheffield, hello. I put in a complaint to their HR department when I got not shortlisted. I'm like, I'm on an automatic shortlisting category, and I filled it in your website. Does your algorithm not work? Why am I getting this email saying that something that I'm perfectly 100% qualified for and have experience in on my CV, why am I suddenly not being interviewed for something that you're supposed to do automatic interviews for? And so it's crazy. And we don't even have that scheme in Australia. We don't have that.
I've been trying to get organisations to actually do something like that, which is part of my, that's my activism, is to say, particularly for the transgender diverse community, what's the problem in Australia is out of the more than 2,500, probably now 2,800 roles that I've applied for in the last year and a month, 13 months, only one organisation has ever asked a question that would have identified me as trans, although you and I both know that as soon as I get into a situation where I have to supply paperwork, they will identify me. But at the point of application, only one organisation sought that information. So even if they wanted to do something like you're talking about, they couldn't have done it because they wouldn't have known. And I've been trying to get them to, first of all, give us an option to identify if we want to. Tell us why you want us to identify, i.e. we want to help you out because we recognise the barriers you face, and then actually apply that, right? And I can't get anybody even interested in talking about that.
No, well, and it's just interesting that in the UK they're a lot further. They're about 15, 20 years ahead, and I know that they're a bit insane around the trans thing, but they're more forward for sort of cis LGBT stuff, and obviously some of those people are creating the barriers for the trans women. Which is, a whole nother topic.
Yeah, let's not go down the lesbian feminist road, shall we?
Let's not go down the turfy, swerpy people, because they're shocking. But
I think it's, while you brought that up, I think it's also worthwhile to point out that the Murdoch media has a role to play, or has played a huge role there.
Oh, yes, they have. And Uncle Rupee, just die already. Can someone please go and sneeze on him? But he's got to go. And I think Lachlan's been groomed to be the next, great white man. And we've seen it so much in history. We've seen it in history with Henry Ford. Was the same. He was very anti-Semitic. We've seen it with Walt Disney. they've still got animatronic native Indians,
Yeah.
Native American Indians at Disneyland. I went there with my kids, and it was like, oh yes, and here's the natives welcoming us, and I'm like, that's not what happened. Frontier Wars, anybody? Genocide? No. Okay, thanks, Walt.
Yeah, let's not tell the bad story.
Let's not tell the bad story. Pocahontas was clearly, in love. No, she wasn't. But it really, it's just these people that want this happily ever after narrative, and they're mostly white men that are trying to create that. And I've been attacked by the murder press. They threw me under the bus when I was suicidal 2 years ago because I said trolley dolly on Twitter. And it was like, that was somehow me, the big feminist, being not feminist. And I'm like, are you kidding? Trolley dollies of all genders. Don't be bloody rude. It's just a slang term in this country. It's Australian. But that got onto Fox News in the US.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, they're very quick to pick out what they think might be. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So any sniff of a feminist having a go at another feminist, a feminist being not feminist, they got straight on it. And that was a woman that used to a woman who basically had been to London, and she'd been working at the Sun in London, and so she'd learnt the British tabloid gutter snipe and then brought that back to the Herald Sun.
It's interesting. I used the term brolly dolly at a gliding event.
Brolly dolly.
And got into trouble for the same because
Did you get into trouble?
Yeah, and it was a guy holding an umbrella. It was a man, cisgender, heterosexual man holding the umbrella, and I called him my brolly dolly.
But why is being referred to as a woman a bad thing?
Exactly. This is the point. Right? And I used the term just to highlight the fact that, this was an unusual situation, because in the past what would have happened was they would have employed women at very low rates to stand around holding umbrellas to shade the men. And here was absolutely. A situation where the trans woman was recognizing that and going, I've got a guy standing here, I'm going to refer to him as a brolly dolly. So anyway.
That's it. But I mean, it can get a bit crazy. But the best thing that I had happen to me last year in recruitment, I didn't sadly get the job, but I actually was interviewed by a trans woman on an interview panel, and that's the first time that had happened in my career. And I was like, oh, this is so nice.
Yeah, somebody got it right.
They chose someone else, but that's, again, I didn't have I think they were looking for someone that had worked for a clinical trials company, and they gave 2 part-time jobs, one to a younger, fitter woman and one to an older man. So
and it's worth pointing out that we're not actually bitching about the fact that sometimes we aren't a good match for the role that we might apply for, right? Because when you have to apply for so many roles as we do, you do kind of start to get to a scattergun approach at certain points in your desperation.
Well, I mean, right? I don't take the scattergun approach because I'm so specialist with my CV, I can't. And so I only apply for things that I cover 110% of the essential and desired. Like literally, I don't apply unless I tick every box. And I declare my disability in the cover letter, saying that I will need, shock horror, the accommodation of maybe working from home in my pajamas 1 or 2 days a week. Gee. But apparently it takes a global pandemic for everybody to get that accommodation.
It does.
Because apparently they couldn't do it for me.
It does, apparently. But, there are a number of trans women that I've worked with through the trans employment program who've told me that, they do get rather desperate at times. And, and I can share that, my savings are completely gone. I'm living off that job seeker payment, which was late, by the way. But anyway.
I saw you commented on that, yeah.
So, but the point is, we're not actually complaining where we are actually not a good fit to the role. That's fine, right? But
that's fine.
What I'm saying is that if you, and this has been the case in certain instances where I've been interviewed, and they said, it was down to you and another candidate. In that circumstance, I'm like, you could have applied a little bit of positive discrimination here. I'm sure the other candidates will get another job, but, and I'm sure they haven't had to apply for 2,800 jobs.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had an interview. I mean, I basically have had 3 examples this year that I could have taken to the Human Rights Commission, and I actually took one of them. Thankfully, I didn't actually end up getting that job because that university is about to go into administration, so I would have been laid off anyway. But again, they tried to tell me that being a microbiologist didn't fit the socio model of One Health, and I'm like, excuse me. You saw it on my CV that it actually had that I wrote emerging infectious diseases in there, and I copied the links to the Deakin website. And I was the course director, and I did that from scratch. And you're telling me I can't teach public health, really? Okay. And I didn't get an interview because maybe they had an internal candidate.
Yeah, well, that happens too, of course. And what we're talking about that from a diversity and inclusive perspective, because I've had the same thing happen. I went to this particular organisation and I said, you need to rethink the way you do these internal hires. If you're going to do an internal hire, you know what, just go ahead and do it, right?
Well, that's it. Don't advertise it.
Don't advertise it, right? And it happens all the time. In fact, I want to share that I applied for my first job in 1979, so I'm declaring my age now. And I hardly ever, if ever, applied for a job up until I moved to Sydney, because that's what happened. And either internally, or I'd be working for an organisation as a project chemist, and Beck's Laboratories would come in and say, "Hey, why don't you come work for us? We really like what you do." And that's happened all the time.
Yeah, but there's this whole industry now of these sort of recruitment agencies. And the government has actually encouraged it in the last 2 terms of 2 or 3. It's been since Howard pretty much. That there's this whole, we need to build capacity. Like, I got an email today from the NDIS telling me I could apply to get a grant to run a program to build capacity in disabled people. I'm like, well, if you give me 10 grand to put in my disabled person owned business, that would help more. That would help me more right now. I don't want to build capacity. I have capacity. I'm not using capacity. I'm on the books of a disabled employment service, helping other people that are able-bodied,
qualified person who has capacity but no actual role. Yeah. Look, and I think, to get back to what I was talking about there, they don't understand that putting us through that process is really anxiety-inducing. To make us apply for a role, go in front of a panel, do all that stuff, and then come out and say, you weren't successful, and then it becomes obvious. In fact, it was obvious before I even applied for this role. I said to one of the executives, I know who's going to get this job because it's all around the Sydney D&I network. Who's going to get the job? Yeah. So why are you interviewing me? Because all you do is creating anxiety.
We had to tick a box to pretend we were being, so that we could, when on some sort of diversity audit, we could say we interviewed X number of disabled, X number of trans, X number of, people of colour. But at the end of the day, we gave it to the white lady called Karen.
Yeah, so let's just make it really clear. Stop doing that, please. Just stop it. If you're going to do an internal hire, just do the damn hire.
Yeah, I have to get a set of nails on every time I do an interview. I have to go and pay $50 for S&S, okay?
I can't even afford to do my eyebrows anymore. Or my nails.
Oh my God, look at mine. And you shouldn't see my lower legs either. Oh, no.
All right, I've run out of light here, and I think we've covered the topic really well. I just want to finish up there, but stay on the line because I just want to ask you a question.
Yeah, totally.
So thanks very much for, for prompting me to get you to speak, basically.
Yeah, no, it'd be great. I love doing these kind of things. I've spoken with a friend of mine who is one of my mates that I kick about with in the Geelong disability space, and she's getting an anthropology business going. And so her and I spoke. She was talking about physical disabilities versus invisible disabilities. So she had me on doing that. And so, it's really good to get that sort of, 2 perspectives and talk about the intersections and the barriers that are common or different. And it's just really, those kind of conversations are just so valuable to get out there.
Yeah.
And frankly, the D&I space is shocking. you know.
Yeah. All right. Let's finish it up there.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
No worries.